Great. Well, hello. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you join us for Public Service and Advocacy Networking Night. I am Cheryl Rosenberg from the Career Center at Tufts, and I'm joined by my fellow Career Center colleagues, Willa Mayo and Sue Atkins. And I'll be moderating this panel tonight that kicks off our evening. So we got a lot to cover today, but before we begin, I do want to give a quick note to everyone joining us today, all of the students in the room here. We want this session to be interactive. It's an interactive night. And so Will and Sue will be monitoring the chat while the panel is happening, while I'm moderating, and we're all talking here in this big room together. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll incorporate them into our talk tonight. And then you will have plenty of time after the panel to ask your follow-up questions or other questions you think of during the individual networking time. And that leads us to our panel on building a professional path making a difference. So our goal here tonight is to help students get an inside look at understanding the variety of different ways they can pursue careers as change agents. I am excited that we have some really awesome alumni with us tonight, all doing very different type of work from different types of roles involving public service and advocacy. So without further ado, let's begin by having each of our panelists introduce themselves. And as you do, I'm going to ask you to give us a brief overview, like a high level 3,000-foot view of where you're working now, what your current professional role is, and who you are. And let's see, John, let's go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Hey, everybody, I'm John Rumpler, and I'm currently Clean Water Program Director with Environment America, which is a national environmental advocacy group. I work with advocates and activists all across the country for stronger policies to protect our rivers, lakes, streams, and drinking water. And I'm an alum of the class of '88, which is where I got my start doing this work.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And Emily, let's go to you next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Kotonik, and I am Treasurer Goldberg's Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs. And the Treasurer is one of 5 constitutional officers that's elected statewide in Massachusetts. We have around 800 people in our organization, and we oversee a little bit of everything from the Office of Economic Empowerment to the lottery. She also sits as chair in the pension fund. We do a little clean water work too, so there might be some overlap in our spaces. So we're kind of the home for wayward state agencies, but our mission sort of throughout all of the work that we do is securing economic opportunity and prosperity for all residents of our state.
Fantastic. I love that you all are able to give such brief overviews of your roles too, which is probably a professional skill to learn, right? So let's add our third panelist, Stephanie, and have you introduce yourself as well.
Hi, can you all hear me? Sorry, I was having
Yes.
some technical difficulties earlier. Okay. Yeah, hi, my name is Stephanie Kerr. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently a judicial law clerk for a magistrate judge with the U.S. District Courts in the Eastern District of Wisconsin. So I'm currently in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I graduated from Tufts in 2014 with a degree in psychology and community health. Did not think that I would ever become a lawyer or a law clerk, but that's the wild path that we all follow. And so in my current role, I was trying to think of how to describe it because being a clerk was not a job that I knew existed before going to law school. But I essentially am kind of like a research assistant for a federal judge instead of a professor. So I am the person who's responsible for doing most of the research and initial drafting of decisions and orders at any point in a case that comes before us in federal court, which could be on a variety of topics from Social Security appeals to, criminal matters, contract disputes, anything like that. So I've really gotten a wide range of experience, but ultimately just doing research and writing.
Fantastic. And we're going to get into those skills and what you actually do day to day in a bit, because that's always the good stuff that we want to know. But before we dive deeper into your work and your unique paths that have led you here, I think it would be helpful for everyone attending, the students, to map out as best we can the public service and advocacy landscape a bit more. So we'll start with the three of you, and then I'm going to actually ask a few other of our alumni guests to speak just a little bit. And Stephanie, let's start with you. If you were to map like in this ecosystem of public life, where would you place your work at the district courts? How would you sort of categorize or organize that?
Yeah, I think being at the district courts has been a really interesting experience so far. I think so earlier in my career, right after I, graduated from Tufts, I was doing direct services work in education, and then started sort of questioning, maybe I want to do more like systemic level change. And so I decided to go to law school. And then sort of in law school, I still felt that tug of if I want to do direct services, if I want to do, more broad impact sort of litigation work, sort of, like the work they do at like the ACLU and things like that. And then I sort of learned about the district courts, and I think the district courts sit in a really interesting space because we're not traditional advocates by any means, right? Like part of a judge's duty is to sort of apply the law to the facts at hand, and do that in as neutral a way as possible. But, as we've sort of learned, I think a lot of people have learned a lot about the judiciary, myself included, especially during Trump's term. And as we move into Biden's term now, the judiciary, I think, has been a really big topic of conversation. And I think part of that is because although they're non-traditional advocates, I think judges do still play some sort of an advocacy role in the ways that they sort of look at different cases that are before them and sort of the ways that they interpret the law, right? And the ways that they're treating plaintiffs that are coming before them. And so I think district courts sit at a really interesting sort of space where we are not traditional advocates, but we can still provide people with relief, and we can still connect people with resources that are helpful, which is something that I didn't know much about before actually working for the court. Appointing counsel for people who are unrepresented and can't afford counsel, having connections with different organizations in the individual communities where the courts sit. So I think that there is more work there than I expected coming into it, but I do think that ultimately, courts sit at a really sort of strange place within this sort of advocacy landscape.
A unique place, right? And Emily, same question to you.
Yeah, sure. So we're a little adjacent to Stephanie in that we are, squarely within government. We are not impartial, however, by any stretch of the imagination. So, I work for an elected official. She's a Democrat. She was elected to uphold a certain set of, very progressive principles. And so we do view our work through that lens. We are an administrative office, or an executive office, I should say. So we do kind of straddle the line where we do some direct work with the legislature advocating for priorities, but we also have the ability to policy set ourselves. We also do, the direct service work. Constituent service, never goes away. I think in direct government work, you work for the people, you answer to them. We want to make sure that everyone has a great experience with government, no matter where they slot into it. So I think that's kind of where we fall.
Perfect and wonderful. John, on to you.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question in just a quick second, but I'm dying to know, Stephanie, which judge are you clerking for?
Yes, so I clerk for Judge Nancy Joseph, who's a magistrate judge. Yep. She's really fantastic. And part of the reason I wanted to work for her, just for some background, she's the only woman of color in this district here in Wisconsin. I think she's the only federal judge of color in, in the state of Wisconsin, the only federal judge of color. She was a career public defender, both state level and federal level. So she's just a really cool person. So yeah, speaking of sort of that advocacy role that judges can kind of play, she's a big reason why I ended up sort of working for the courts to begin with.
Yeah. Well, I had the privilege of working with Judge Patty Saris here in Boston, so that's why I was curious. But to answer your question, Cheryl, I think about the big picture of social change in a few different ways. I think about changes in policy, right? Actual public policy changes, whether those are in the courts or the administrative branch or the legislature or even at the local level, actual changes in policy. I think about changes in awareness, right? Long before we can get changes in policy, we need to form the public will that allows those policy changes to take place. Just think of the huge social movements in this country. Long before legislative change, it was about winning in the court that I think is the most important in my work, which is the court of public opinion. So that's another way to think about social change, is public education and winning hearts and minds. And then, there's sort of a whole separate world of change that's kind of in the entrepreneurial, technological, and scientific innovation realm. How will we ever confront climate change without more renewable energy and making it cheaper and faster and more reliable? And we've seen incredible advances there over the last 20 years. I think I would say that if those are sort of three big buckets of social change: policy, changing public opinion and behavior, and then technological change, I think my work is really in the first two buckets. That what I do at Environment America is we are first trying to win the hearts and minds for a sustainable agenda so we can have a livable planet and clean air and clean water for all. And then we go to work trying to convince policymakers to do the very pragmatic, incremental, possible things we can win today towards that agenda. And it's kind of an iterative process, right? Because if we can win some things along the way, that helps move the needle on public opinion. We can only win anything if the public is with us and demanding that their policymakers take action. So I think I sort of stand at the intersection of those big picture buckets of social change, if you will.
Yeah, that was a very great mapping and helpful way for some of our students to think about how to organize the process of change. So before we dive a little deeper into the three of you and your unique paths that led you here, I want to touch a little bit more on two other areas. One is research, and one is, I like to think about it as infrastructure, but I'm going to let Eleanor name it for herself. So to complete the picture a little bit more. So I'm going to invite up another wonderful alum, Eleanor Bieber, who graduated
just like Justin.
Just like Justin, and who graduated in 2008. And Eleanor has a Master's of Science in Public Health from Northeastern, and has recently worked for United Health Group and now works for Primary Care Development Corporation. So Eleanor, can you give us a brief introduction to you and where you work at Primary Care Development Corporation, how that fits into this kind of map we're creating here?
Sure, thanks, Cheryl, and hi, everyone. So I have spent my career working in community health, in healthcare, and more recently in community development. And so I'm really passionate about healthcare, helping people have more access to care. And I work at a national nonprofit, Community Development, Primary Care Development Corporation, PCDC, which is a community development financial institution, or a CDFI. And there are about 1,000 CDFIs across the country, and they're basically all mission-driven financial institutions. And so they help bring capital to sectors and communities that really need it. So some of them focus on small businesses, some of them focus on minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses. And what makes PCDC unique is we focus solely in healthcare. And so The work that I do as a senior loan officer is focused in the Midwest and the Southeast, and developing partnerships and relationships with groups in the healthcare space to kind of better understand current challenges and to help bring capital to organizations to help them expand their services. The primary client group that we work with is federally qualified health centers, which, if you're interested in healthcare, is a really fabulous group to be aware of. I'll put some information both about CDFIs and FQHCs in the chat, but FQHCs are safety net providers. There's about 1,000 across the country, and they provide services to folks regardless of ability to pay and regardless of insurance coverage type. And so the impact that I get to do in my work is to help those organizations expand and maybe provide behavioral health services for the first time, or dental services for the first time, or expand those services. And so that's really fulfilling to me, to be able to see the impact that that has in communities.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Eleanor. And I want to ask, I'm going to bring up also now a recent graduate, Dana, who just graduated from TUS in 2020 and works at Pew Research Center. I think a lot of students here today might be like you, Dana, in that they're wondering what they can do with their experience in research that has been prioritized at Tufts to contribute to positive change. And knowing that Pew is a non-advocacy organization, it would be great to hear how you think about the impact of your work and where that falls in the broader landscape.
Sure, that's a really good question. So at a 30,000 foot level, I see my impact as helping generate facts that help educate the public, enrich dialogue, and decision making. But for more context, I work for Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan think tank that conducts public opinion research, demographic analysis, and other data-driven social science research. And at Pew, I work on the methods team, which basically means that I work with all the research teams like politics, social demographic trends, race and ethnicity, tech. There's a lot of them, so I'm not going to try and name them all. But we're measuring attitudes on a really wide range of topics. So my day-to-day changes all the time. You know, from one week, I could be working on a survey on American perspectives on climate change, and the next asking folks about their experience with AI in the workplace. And my role in this process is to make sure that the research is of the highest data quality. So when someone asks, you know, what do Americans think about abortion or religion or politics, I think the best possible answer is the most accurate answer, regardless of my own personal opinion. And so to get the most accurate data, I help review questionnaires to make sure that we're asking questions that are clear and unbiased. And I work with our senior methodologists to draw representative samples of Americans for our studies. And I also work to study different types of survey error, like non-response bias, to make sure that our panel is representative of all Americans, regardless of the type of people that like taking surveys. So when I think about my impact, like the larger impact, I think it's working to produce the highest quality data that can then be used by policymakers, by civic leaders, you know, by advocates, by the public at large, to both understand and then address some of the country's most challenging problems. So I guess, like in a nutshell, I see myself as helping produce the data that then change can then be built off of.
Probably data that our other panelists often get to use. Yeah, wonderful.
I hope so.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Dina. And thanks again, Eleanor and Dina, for popping in to give us a little taste of other parts of the landscape. And I wish we could do this with everyone, but that is what the second part of the night is for. So this is just a preview. So we also have a handful of great direct service organizations and professionals working at those nonprofits here tonight. So make sure that everyone gets a chance to take the opportunity to talk with them during the second half of the night. And so now that we have this bit of a map, we have some ideas of these different places that you could intersect and work in this broader landscape. I want to ask about some challenges. or pros about being kind of positioned where you are. So I have a question for you, Stephanie, which turns out is kind of perfect because I know you mentioned working in direct service and then wanting to impact change on a different levels. And I think that's something our students think about a lot, exploring the different approaches to social impact work, direct service versus big structural change. So what initially drew you down the path that you're on? And you can sort of talk about pivoting between them. And what are some of the challenges that come with advocating at the scale you work at today?
Yeah, definitely. So it's also a question that I am still answering for myself, to be completely honest. I'm sort of at the beginning of my second career, I could say. So right after I graduated, I worked for an education nonprofit called City Year. I did 2 years of AmeriCorps service with them and then joined staff. And so I was doing very direct services. I was in schools working with students, managing a team of people when I became a manager. And I really loved doing that work, but I definitely found myself sort of questioning, what more can I do? Especially working in schools, you sort of see the intersection of all of these oppressive systems sort of coming together and impacting the lives of the youth that I was working with, things from food insecurity to financial inequality, immigration issues, foster system issues. And so that's when I started sort of questioning, okay, well, what should be the next step? And, so I eventually came to law school. So I graduated from NYU Law in May of 2022. So very recent graduate. And in law school, I still found myself sort of questioning and having that, pull and of which direction do I want to go into? And yeah, because I think that there's lots of different pathways, especially, if anyone's interested in law generally. I think there's so many different options and so many different things that you can do, with a law degree. And I found that, the plethora of choices to be exciting, but also a little overwhelming. And so I think the focus for me currently at this phase is just really just getting as many different experiences as I can. And I think part of that sort of thought process came from I took a class in law school. If any of you have ever read the book Just Mercy or seen the movie Just Mercy, I took a class with Bryan Stevenson. And I think one of the things that he talks about is even if you're doing really large systemic work, it's really important to be proximate with the communities that you're working with and to have a deeper understanding of the issues that are impacting them, and not just always having that sort of like 30,000 foot view. And so that's kind of the approach that I'm trying to bring in to my work. Even at the U.S. District Courts, I'm new to the Milwaukee community, but I'm trying to engage with the community as best I can to understand it, to understand who are the people that are coming before us in the court system. Because of course, in the courts, we're seeing, issues after they've already happened, after the harm has already been done. And it's our job to sort of apply the law to try to address the harm as best we can. But I do think that it's really crucial and important to understand where that harm is coming from and the roots of that harm and get to know the individual communities that you're working within. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And I think you talked about challenges, some of the challenges in my work is that I'm kind of having to do that on my own time, right? Like federal judges have really expansive dockets. There's tons of cases that are before us and, on such a wide variety of issues, things that I've never seen before in my life. And I have to, sort of help the judge make a decision that's as fair as possible. And sometimes the law isn't necessarily on our side and we have to, kind of see and understand where we can push and where we can't. And so, yeah, I do think that that's kind of a challenge is just sort of, where we're situated, when people are coming before us, we are kind of limited in the things that we can do to support. And we're definitely far from preventing the harms that, keep bringing litigants before us. And so I do think that's a challenge that I'm still sort of grappling with.
Yeah, that was really fantastic the way you laid that out. Even made me think about just where your point of view is from your position that I hadn't really considered before. Great. Emily, maybe next you can walk us through your career path. And, you know, in particular, especially from the student perspective, we're always looking up at folks that we might like to have a career like theirs and wondering how they got there. So I'm wondering what are, you know, if you can think of a couple key moments or experiences that ultimately led you to where you are now as the Director of Policy and Legislation.
Sure. And I love this question because it all started at Tufts. So I grew up in Colorado. I'm from Colorado and loved politics. Always thought that I would work in politics or policy in some capacity, but kind of always saw myself down in DC. Little did I know there's this whole Massachusetts state government that does real amazing, impactful work. And I took a state government class at Tufts that really opened my eyes to this field or to this line of government work. And I got to, as a result of taking that class, I got to intern with a state representative and just absolutely fell in love. There's much more of a direct connection to constituents while still getting to do really fun and impactful policy work. So after Tufts, you know, I applied to every state house position that was open. I landed in the state Senate for a year or so. I followed Stephanie's lead and went to law school. It's the most fun I never, ever want to have again. And, you know, after I graduated, I knew I wanted to go back. I went to law school thinking that it would advance my career in the state house. And I applied to every job again that was available when I graduated, but it was a really tough market. And so what I came away with was a constituent services, you know, director. So not touching policy or legislation at all. So I was the person who answered the phone, who interfaced directly with constituents who, you know, were having issues. And I may have been a little bummed at first, but it was honestly the best thing that ever could have happened to me because I got that like real time understanding of what issues constituents were really facing, what issues really matter to them. And then I had to call the state agencies that were in charge of, you know, fixing that problem and figure out like who was doing a good job and maybe who could use a little coaching along the way. And I, you know, built my network around state government doing this constituent work as well. I then worked my way, you know, up the ladder in my small state Senate office to be chief of staff and was helping to run the Senate bonding committee. And we oversaw, you know, a huge slew of, you know, public finance bills. And I kind of quickly came to realize that you can't impact, you know, all these areas that I felt really passionately about. Education reform, you can't do that without money, right? And the dollars and cents really, really matter. And so I got to know the state treasurer's office a little bit more through my work on the Senate bonding committee. And it just was a natural fit to kind of slide over to this work. And I really love it. It was by happenstance entirely. You know, it wasn't something I could have plotted out, but it's a better story than I could have written for myself.
That's great to hear. And I love that you mentioned happenstance because I'm actually going to ask John a similar question that might involve some happenstance as well. Because John, you have also had an interesting path that led you here. And I know that you also did advocacy work with tobacco control and community and environment. I want to know, is this what you imagined you'd be doing way back when you were a history and philosophy major wandering the halls of Tufts? And, you know, tell us about some of the big decisions you made that ended up leading you here today.
Yeah, well, I guess just thinking about what you just said in terms of, you know, my history and philosophy major, one thing I would just say to students is don't worry what you're majoring in. Just figure out who the best professors are at Tufts who are going to inspire you and, you know, teach you to think critically about something. And, you know, unless you're going into something like engineering or, you know, or veterinary school, you know, something that like you obviously clearly need to be in that program for that profession. But most of the work that we're talking about here in the social change world, one way or another, it doesn't really matter what you major in. It's about your passion, your inspiration, your critical thinking. So let me just say that. For me, my path really started, it's kind of a weird thing to say now because, but it really started when Ralph Nader came to campus to speak at the Fletcher School. I think it was maybe the fall of 1985. This was back before Ralph kind of went off the deep end, and, you know, we could talk hours about that, but I'll spare you. But you all know he was a, you know, pretty famous consumer and public health and environmental advocate, a real visionary for his time at that moment. And I thought, wow, I mean, these are the kinds of big changes that we need if we're going to have a sustainable planet and if we're going to convince the public for a common agenda for clean air and clean water and protecting consumers. That's what I want to do. So I got involved in the local MassPIRG chapter at Tufts and found myself out in Harvard Square with 2 clipboards in my hand, gathering signatures on a ballot initiative. The big environmental issue at the time was not climate change. Nobody even knew what climate change, well, I'm sure scientists did, but most of us at Tufts didn't know much about climate change. But we did know that there was hazardous waste that was getting into the drinking water of Americans all across the country. Love Canal, a little closer to home, in Woburn, Massachusetts. And so we were working to force the cleanup and accountability for those thousands of sites across Massachusetts. We gathered those signatures, we mobilized and educated the public. To date myself a little bit, Governor Dukakis was running for re-election in 1986, and the Hazardous Waste Cleanup Initiative that year passed by 75% of the vote. It's just amazing to think that we can bring 75% of the public together on anything these days, even in a state like Massachusetts, yet that's what we were able to do. And I was hooked from there. I mean, you know, if I could put my shoulder to the wheel and grind it out and do the work, whether it was the, you know, the canvassing or the phone calling or whatever it was going to take, and then a year later see this huge change, that was very exciting to me to be able to do that. Let me caution all of you, we don't win all the time. These are tough battles. We're up against the oil and gas industry. We're up against huge, powerful polluters. But we win enough of the time to make it incredibly worthwhile and rewarding and so vital. So I think that got me hooked. I then, after Tufts, got a position with the public interest research groups. I was a campus organizer, I was a canvas director, I was a field organizer. One of our state directors directing our whole state organization happened to leave to go to grad school. So one day my boss said, "How would you like to move to Ohio and become our new state director there?" I was like, wow, I've never been to Ohio, but that sounds pretty cool. A few weeks later, I was in Washington, D.C., lobbying the entire Ohio congressional delegation in one day. One of the elderly members of the delegation asked if I was a constituent. I said, I will be next week. And there I was in Columbus. I then went to law school thinking I wanted to be a litigator. Like perhaps some of you, I was a high school debater for 4 years and imagined myself maybe not being a clerk in the federal court, but standing up and doing appellate argument in the court. That's where I thought I could make my mark. I do love public speaking. What I found out is that litigation is not always glamorous. Litigation is a lot of paperwork. Litigation is a lot of arguing over discovery and lots of petty squabbles. My sister is a criminal defense attorney, and my cousin works in the U.S. Attorney's Office, so I know from which I speak. And so I admire litigators. I work with them all the time. We are engaged in litigation, but I decided after a while that that wasn't necessarily the place where I wanted to spend all of my hours. I got a chance after law school to work with a professor there who had been pounding away at the tobacco industry for 30 years, losing all of these litigated cases that were brought up because the common mantra was, well, you know, if you're smoking, you knew the risks, it's your fault, blame the victim. That's kind of what but when the door got burst open on what the tobacco industry knew and the fact that nicotine is addictive and all of that, suddenly things started to change. And I was just in the right place at the right time. And working with the Tobacco Resource Control Center, I was, right in the front row seats of the litigation of the attorneys general against the tobacco industry in the 90s. So that was sort of a fortuitous circumstance if you're talking about, opportunities along the way. But not too far from from Northeastern University, which is where I went to law school and was working with this professor, stone's throw away from the Northeastern campus is Roxbury, which is the heart of the Black community in Boston. And there was an environmental justice group working there, Alternatives for Community and Environment. I always wanted to get back to environmental work. This was an opportunity to combine my law degree representing local community groups in environmental fights, where they sometimes would need a lawyer, but sometimes really what they needed was a political strategy for organizing. And so I was able to take my work with the PIRGs and my law degree together to go work for community organizations in Roxbury, Dorchester, Chelsea, Mattapan, and many other communities of color and low-income communities across Eastern Massachusetts. Did that for a few years. It was really exciting, really rewarding. My friends back at the PIRGs and the Public Interest Network came calling and said, we really would like you to rejoin the team on the national level and run our clean water program. And that's what I decided to do in 2003. And I just celebrated my 20th anniversary in this role. So sorry for the long answer, but it's been a long ride.
Well, that's great, John. Thank you for all of that. It really paints a picture, and really all three of you, of the different routes that students can take, and really even not knowing exactly where they all might lead in the end, but just taking one meaningful step at a time. And let's see, we have a little bit of time left here as a panel. So one thing I want to make sure I ask you three about is trends or, concerns, events, things that might be coming up in your, what you're noticing coming up as trends, I guess, in your spaces. So let's start with Stephanie. Tell us what a trend might mean for you and what you're seeing a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think, each district court, depending on where they're located, that kind of changes the trends of different things that sort of come up. I have friends that are sort of clerking in other districts, and they are doing a high volume of cases that I have not come across my desk yet. And so I think it's really dependent, but I think generally it's an issue that I am constantly thinking about is the judiciary and diversity within the judiciary, diversity in all sorts of ways, even from career experience. I think, a very traditional path that judges follow is they tend to, work for the U.S. Attorney's Office or state level prosecutors' offices, and then and then take the bench. So there's not a lot of people who come from, nonprofit, like direct services work, come from being, public defenders, things like that. And so I think, diversity within the judiciary is always something to look into. And I think whenever there is space for people to advocate, I think it's really important to do that. So whether it's, judges being elected or even, talking to local representatives, state level representatives about the appointment process, for certain judges, or even to your, more national level folks about who they're appointing, who they're interested in for the federal judiciary as well. So I just think that's just something to really look into. And I think it's been a big topic of conversation, as I said before, but definitely something to, sort of look into. Also, court watching is another big thing that I recommend. You don't need to have a law degree to do that. So if that's something that you're interested in, is sort of, making sure that people's constitutional rights within the court system are, being respected and being valued. I think that's another interesting thing to sort of look into and maybe participate in as well. So yeah, I guess that's my spiel.
Thank you. Emily, what are you noticing coming up in your work often these days?
Sure. So my state treasurer also serves as the president emerita, I think, of the National Association of State Treasurers, which is a bipartisan organization. It really serves to sort of educate both treasurers and staff on the work of Treasury offices. And it's traditionally been very bipartisan. We all got along swimmingly. And then the issue of ESG has become more and more on the forefront for treasurers, both on the right and left. And so we've seen sort of some of the toxic politics that we all have seen play out on the national level, unfortunately trickling down to some of these typically less partisan offices as well. And I think that's where the role of an organization like NAST or similar organizations for attorneys general and governors as well can play a really helpful role in making sure that folks get to know each other as individuals as well, before turning to these more controversial topics.
Great. And John, trends in your organizing and advocacy space? Yeah,
I would say two interrelated things, and they relate somewhat to what Emily was just referring to, just the increasingly partisan nature of politics in America today. It's almost as if people line up on issues having nothing to do with the facts, nothing to do with the core things at stake, but just if the other people are for it, I must be against it. And for our kind of work, where we're trying to form a overwhelming majoritarian support for big policy changes, that's a huge challenge, because if we're going to really protect our rivers from pollution and solve climate change and ensure clean air for everyone in America, we are going to need the votes and support of people who not only call themselves avowed liberals, but also people who are adamantly considering themselves conservatives. Not all of them, but enough of them, right? And so we're just going to need to find a way. The challenge is to find that common ground. I'll tell you one little note of sunshine in that regard. We just released a report on lead in schools' drinking water, which is a huge problem all across the country. And I want to give a quick shout out to Treasurer Goldberg, who has actually, in her work, and Emily, maybe you've even personally been involved in this, has actually been instrumental in funding efforts for schools to at least voluntarily mitigate lead contamination through the SWIG program here in Massachusetts. In an example of finding common ground on that issue, we just released a huge report grading the states on their failures to deal with this problem. And lo and behold, in addition to coverage from CBS and Public Radio and USA Today, we got an amazingly fact-driven, exactly correct article on Fox News. And I say that because we need to be able to reach the people who read and watch and consume information from Fox News, or we're never going to be able to get the kinds of changes we need to get. So that's one change, that partisanship and how we're trying to combat it. And then let me stop there because I don't want to take up our time, but I do have a related point if there is time.
I think that there are so many good follow-up questions and things that everyone has to share that the students are going to be running to all of the breakout rooms in just a moment, because there is so much to share. We didn't during this panel, but I do want to ask one last question to wrap us up that I know students, well, is really on students' minds. There are, we like to think about what skills are needed for this type of work, and really what kind of skills should students be developing now, regardless of what corner or intersection they may find themselves in later, if they want to be working in a role where they're having impact and helping affect change. So let's go quickly down the line, like lightning round. If you were to hire an intern or a recent grad for a job, what what are the one or two skills or traits, qualities that you would be looking for in someone? And Stephanie, let's start with you. We'll go Stephanie, Emily, and John.
I'm like, I am a recent grad and I'm hiring no one, but I can definitely think. I think, for me, it's political education. I think, really trying to develop an understanding of the different systems that are at play in any role that you're going to be working in. And I would also say, I think, interpersonal skills, being able to connect with people. That's something that, was really important during all of my experiences in law school. Didn't have the highest grades, but I could connect with people. And I think that, was really helpful in the work that I wanted to do. And also, I think writing, being able to advocate well through writing, I think is really crucial. And that includes social media writing as well, which is becoming a really important part of any sort of advocacy work.
Great, yeah.
All right, I think I'm next. So for us, what we really look for when we're hiring is somebody who is sort of flexible and adaptable. We're a small office. Our executive office is a pretty small team of around 10 people within this larger organization. And so I think being able to go into any organization and identify what gaps and needs are in any given team and just fill them. No task is too big, no task is too small. Having someone who has that sense of awareness of the organizational need and the ability and willingness to step up on their own is pretty impactful.
Okay. John, what are the top couple skills or qualities you look for? I know you just hired a student intern at the career fair the other week.
Yeah. We've hired one, but we're hiring more. So we definitely have room for more Tufts interns this summer, if not working with me on clean water, then working with my colleague, Johanna Newman, also a Tufts alum, on clean energy and climate, either here in Boston or in DC or Denver, Colorado, or Chicago. We've got offices across the country and tons of opportunities, both for internships as well as career positions. So definitely come talk to me. What are we looking for? I think we're looking for passion and alignment with our mission and our way of doing things. So go to our website, read our values statement, make sure that we're the right place for you. And then beyond that, I would say, a lot of the things Emily said and Stephanie said, flexibility is critical. We need to be nimble and be able to seize opportunities. So we need people who are willing to take on different roles and not get locked into just, I only want to do X all the time. We need people who are excellent communicators, just like Stephanie said. And also, like Stephanie said, interpersonal skills are absolutely the bread and butter of political and policy change. So I just want to echo what my fellow panelists have said. All those things matter.
Wonderful. And I know so many great follow-up conversations about what you do, like day-to-day work-life balance and experiences that students can have now to have impact and also prepare for their careers after graduation are to come in this second portion of our night. So I want to take this time now to once again thank our panelists for leading and lending their expertise and insights. Thank you.